Kristen Atchison here, and we are continuing our discussion of social psychology, and we're finishing up our discussion on social influence, discussing conformity and obedience. So remember, social psychology is the study of how people think, influence, and relate to other people. And this is both in real life and experimental settings. And we've given you several examples, both online and in the class so far, to kind of show you those things. So we've already talked about social cognition. Social behavior will be our next lecture. We've already in class talked about group influence and prejudice. And today we're going to finish up with social influence on conformity and obedience. So conformity, it can be both unconscious or it can be deliberate. So sometimes we do things purposely, explicitly, so that we fit in. There are other times that we do it, though, however, without necessarily thinking about it. We can have these unconscious ones, too. And compliance is another thing that we'll talk about. And obedience is compliance towards an authority. So it's kind of this continuum where we have conformity on one side, we have obedience on the other, we have compliance kind of in the middle. So we have this kind of spectrum of these. So conformity is going to be related to obedience. And so what we know about conformity will apply to our discussion of obedience. So one of the things that we do in conformity is called the chameleon effect. And this is that unconscious piece of it. We unconsciously mimic others' expressions, postures, tones, especially when we like them. So if the person that we're with is someone we admire, someone we like, someone we love, we're more likely to behave that way. Have you ever noticed that you end up sounding like someone and talking like someone without necessarily thinking about it, just for spending time with them? So when I was in college, I went to Texas A&M University, and I had a good friend who was from a smaller town in Texas, and I had grown up in Houston. My parents were from Illinois and South Dakota, so I didn't really have much of a Texas accent, if any. And I came back from that first semester at Texas A&M, and would say things like fire ant. Instead of fire ant, I was saying fire ant. And instead of our football arena was called Kyle Field, and I was calling it Kyle Field. So I was kind of unintentionally, unconsciously picking up this speech from a good friend who I was spending a lot of time with. So this is, again, that unconscious mimicry. We can do it with our expressions, with our postures. And again, this is more likely to be done when it's someone that we actually enjoy. For another example, people are eager to fit in with the group and unconsciously mimic members of the group. So one of the studies that really showed this chameleon effect where a researcher, the Confederate, would in an interaction either be assigned to rub their face or would be assigned to shake their foot. Now these are typical behaviors, so we expect to see a face rub from the participants, and we expect to see a foot shake from the participants, just under normal kinds of things. These aren't like abnormal behaviors in any way, shape, or form. They're not something that someone's going to look at and go like, hey, that's weird. Why are they doing that? These are just normal kind of behaviors. But what they found is that the participants who saw Confederates rub their face unconsciously mimicked them rubbing their face. And participants that saw the Confederates shaking their foot unconsciously mimicked them shaking their foot. Where you didn't see as much foot shaking or face rubbing in the conditions where they hadn't seen those behaviors. So again, we see this unconscious mimicry as this kind of unconscious piece, this more implicit piece of conformity. There's also some really a little bit more historic, classic lines of experimentation on conformity precisely. So the participants were in a research grouping like this, where there were several people in the room, and they were shown this image. So they had a line, and they had 3 comparison lines, and they had to ask which line equals the standard line. And you can see that there were several people set up in the room. The seating was set up, though, so that only one person was an actual participant, and everybody else in the room was a Confederate. And it was set up so that the Confederates answered the question first. Okay, so they were all asked, which line do you think matches? Confederates mostly, so the most of the Confederates would give the wrong answer. So it wasn't unanimous always, but sometimes it was. And then it would be time for the participant to answer. And what they found is that more than a third of participants also gave the wrong answer. Now, it was really clear which line was the right line, but if everybody else said 1, you didn't want to be wrong and say 2. And so this is an example. This was one of the first examples that really showed how even when you know something is wrong, you might still go with the group. You might still conform to the group. So there's different conditions that strengthen conformity, one of which is if the person's made to feel incompetent. So in some way, that person's made to feel like they don't know what they're talking about, they're less likely to speak up. And so again, if everybody else is saying it's one thing and you're the only one going, hey, no, that's number 2, you start to question yourself. Am I right? You need to have enough people. So it can't just be like 2 people. It needs to be at least a group of 3 people, so that there is kind of a lopsidedness, a kind of more of a pressure. The huger the crowd, though, however, that's not going to necessarily promote conformity either. That unanimous decisions in the group, the more people that say that the wrong answer is right, the less likely you are to disagree with them. Again, if you have a person that's, just like in that chameleon effect, if you admire the people in that group, if you admire the attractiveness of that group, whether it be academically attractive or physically attractive or socially attractive, whatever the reason, if there's some sort of admiring going on there, someone that you like and you want to be more like, you're more likely to conform in that situation. And the person has not made a prior commitment to any response. So if the seating had been changed, and I'm sure that they did this, if the participant went first, and then everybody else said the wrong answer, the participant's not likely to go back and say, well, no, I'm wrong, because we don't like to say we're wrong, right? Think back to confirmation bias, right? We don't like to say we're wrong, so we're not going to go back and say, hey, no, I'm wrong. That prior commitment will really kind of act as a buffer against that conformity. And we need to see the group members observe this person's behavior. So it can't be just you write down your answer on a piece of paper. It has to be something that is observable. And so again, by saying their answers out loud in that setting, that was an observable behavior. And we know definitely that a person's culture will really encourage, a person's culture that encourages respect for social standards, people are going to be more likely to do that. And we'll talk about that in a second. So your book discusses, again, these same things. They said that there's psychological factors that contribute to conformity, such as informational social influence, normative social influence. We'll talk about those a little bit more when we get to group influence. We talked about those already, when we talked about group influence. But the informational would be, again, like, the group is kind of providing that information, and that normative social influence is that they're setting the norms for that group. Because it's a larger group, we're setting the norms for that. We also have the biological. Our brain actually responds to nonconformity as it does the same way it responds to making an error. So we really are hugely social creatures to the extent that our brain interprets these things as the same way. And again, like we talked about on the previous slide, that cultural piece of it. So we know that collectivist cultures, cultures that are more we cultures that look at kind of the greater good of the group, these we cultures as opposed to individualistic cultures, these me cultures. The United States is typically more of an individualistic or a me culture. So we see in cultures where we see more collectivism, which tends to be some Eastern cultures. We see it kind of throughout the world, though. We see more conformity in those cultures than we do in individualistic cultures. So compliance of behavior, we're going to switch to obedience now. Compliance of behavior in response to a direct command from authority is what obedience is defined by. So we're complying, we're agreeing to that behavior, but it's based on a direct command from someone in authority. So your parents, your teachers, in this case, the experimenter or the researcher. And Stanley Milgram asked, could someone be pressured to commit an immoral act? And so these are studies that you can't do anymore the way that he did them for ethical concerns, because these people actually thought that they were really harming somebody. And so the way, hopefully you did your online participation, so you watched and you learned all about this. But there was a researcher in the room, and he was saying that if you miss an answer, you need to shock the person in the other room. And you can change the shock level from slight, moderate, strong, very strong, intense, extreme, danger. And then the last one was labeled XXX for death, right? So like these are volt levels that would kill somebody. And the researcher would direct the participant to administer these shocks. Now, in the room next door, there's someone not really being shocked, but the participant doesn't know this, and they are responding. So in a slight shock, you might not hear anything. In an intense, a very strong shock, you would hear like painful sounds. Once we get to danger and severe, almost you would not hear anything, like as in like, hey, maybe this person died. And so again, they looked at this. And this graph shows the percentage of participants who obey the experimenter in follow-up experiments. So we have percentage of people behaving. On the one axis, we have the level of shock across the bottom, the shock levels in volts. And we see that when it's a slight shock, we were getting pretty much 100% obedience. Everybody was doing that. It's just a slight shock. This is what I'm here to do. This is what I'm going to do. But that starts to drop off as that shock level goes up. However, if you notice that the majority of participants continue to obey all the way up till the end, that triple X voltage level, into the almost 70%. So again, we have the majority of participants still participating. Again, that online participation talks about Milgram's Revisited and goes into that kind of detail a little bit more currently as than what we knew then from Milgram's work. So there are also situations that increase obedience. So the person giving orders is close at hand. The experimenter was always in the room with the participant, and they were perceived to be a legitimate authority. So they were perceived, they had a white coat, they were researchers, they were doctors, they had this authority. The authority figure is associated with a prestigious institution. So they worked at a university doing research. So they had this prestigious institution attached to them. The victim was also depersonalized or in another room. So they didn't see the victim, they heard the victim, but they didn't see them. And so that kind of created some depersonalization here that allowed these kinds of things to happen. And there was no role model that was disobeying the authority figure. So think back to conformity, right? When the group did one thing, you were more likely to do that. So if we saw other people disobeying the authority figure, people are more likely to do that as well. So again, this kind of following kind of a thing, which is why we have a comic here of sheep, right? We talk about people who are just followers as sheep. And so the comic says, sure, I follow the herd, not out of brainless obedience, mind you, but out of deep and abiding respect for the concept of community. So sometimes that's what we kind of tell ourselves, right? That we're behaving this way, not because we're just blindly obeying or blindly conforming, but because of these cultural factors, these social factors. So this ends our conversation on obedience. Thanks.